Was Stanford racist?
Very. It was the worst racism I'd faced in my life. Are you kidding? They didn't know I was Black until I showed up, because even though they had affirmative action programs even then, I didn't want anyone later on to say that I'd only been accepted at the university because I was Black. Now, my name is Dina, so you cannot, that's a woman's name. They knew I was female, but they did not know I was Black until I got there. And then the war started. So I was treated so badly. It is like I could make a Netflix drama off of how I was treated at Stanford because I was Black.
How
And,
did that show up, Dina?
oh, it was very simple. When I was in class, and in my year, they had over 700 applications for the PhD program, and they only accepted 9. And so it's a small class. When I asked a question, I was ignored. What I asked was not ever considered. When the professor would arrange to have appointments with each of us, they wouldn't show up to mine. They kept quoting research in the courses about how inferior Black people were. I didn't find out until my second year, after I'd learned to analyze the research, that they knew they were using absolutely irresponsible research that was not rigorous at all. I think it was kind of an experiment to see what I would do. I was, in fact, when I graduated, they finally had a chair for my department, who was the first time having a female chair in my department. And she asked me point blank, how do you handle being treated so differently from everyone else? I told her, eyes on the prize. That I had known and grown up seeing people set on by dogs, beaten, hanged from trees, so that I would have an opportunity to compete. So unless they killed me, and I mean dead, because even if I were on crutches, I would have still gone to class. I told them point blank, you're not getting rid of me.
Were you afraid of physical violence?
No. That's one thing. They were way too cowardly to ever do anything like that. That's too easy to prosecute. That's too easy to have evidence. They had a lot of leeway in how they behaved, because they were tenured professors. The top professors had all been tenured professors at Harvard who had been lured to Stanford. And they got away with a lot, but they knew they couldn't get away with that. So no, I was never physically threatened, but they did everything they could to get me to quit.
And when you were living in Germany and subsequently having lived in Australia, do you notice any differences between the way that racism plays out in those places versus the United States?
I've lived in England and France too, by the way. Yes. Even being from California, and California is definitely not a state with strong racial divisions. People keep giving Australia a hard time, but I have faced much less racism in Australia than I did in the States, even in California. In Germany too. We moved from the Midwest to Germany, and I was treated better. I was like, this is amazing. These people were the former Nazis, and they treated us better than we were treated at home. I thought it was really sad.
In what ways did that show up in your daily life? Can you give us an example?
An easy example, how easily and readily people will just start a conversation with you. How little old ladies act when you walk next to them on the sidewalk. Do they seem unnerved or scared? If people chat with you and like you, do they invite you to your house, to their homes? Australia's been amazing. But I want to say something, and I have to put this out there because I have to be fair. What I didn't realize until I'd lived in Australia for a few years is how much of how I was being treated, not all of it, of course, but how much of it was actually coming from me. My father, when he retired from the military, retired in Tucson, Arizona. And when I lived in California, of course, you go to visit family, you go to see your parents, you go for Christmas. I was very underwhelmed by Tucson. I thought it was kind of an unfriendly place. I moved to Australia. In the first 2 years, my daughter came out to visit me. I couldn't afford to go back. I was short on time, short on money. So 2 years after moving and living in Australia, I went back to Tucson. Now, politically, nothing had really changed. There was no big difference. But all of a sudden, everywhere I went in Tucson, the cashier would start a conversation. People sitting next to us in the restaurant would start a conversation. People would smile at me longer eye contact. All of a sudden, I was treated completely differently. Now, you would not hear me speak or look at me and say, oh, she must live in Australia. So it's not that my living in Australia started the conversation. They'd have no way of knowing that. But my nonverbal behavior had changed from living in a country where I was basically accepted.
It's funny that you say that people in California assume that Australians are racist or more racist, because it really depends on what your definition of racism is. There are certainly codes that I have to speak in with my American counterparts, mostly white university-educated American counterparts, that I have to adhere to, that I don't have to adhere to in Australia. And I certainly don't have to adhere to if I'm speaking with friends of mine who are Black. But there is such an uptightness at the moment among, and terror, really a terror amongst white Americans about making sure that they do the correct thing racially, that it means that all of that closeness and that casualness and that laid backness that you normally use to stoke closeness with another individual have fallen by the wayside. And at least I find the relations between races in the States at the moment to be boxed into quite a cold and rigid archetype, because people don't feel free to treat each other as human beings. They're treating each other as racial categories that they have to make sure they speak to perfectly correctly, otherwise they'll be hounded. So I wonder if that's part of the difference between Australia and the States right now.
Well, one thing you know that in Australia, if you can't take a joke, don't come here. So anybody listening to this, if you're super sensitive and everybody has to use the latest term for who you are, don't come to Australia. Nothing is sacrosanct here. I remember when I was working on a show, and at one point I was trying to explain to the cameraman and the crew why I was having such a hard time at my day job, where everyone kept giving me a hard time about being American. And they were like, we don't understand why you're so sensitive. And I said, okay, try to understand this. By putting down my country, it's like saying your mother is a whore. And they stopped and looked at me. And then one of the guys said, yeah, but she's a good earner. And the next one said, she taught me everything. I mean, they just went around like this. We got no work done because we were on the floor, cracking up laughing like you would not believe. Welcome to Australia.
It's funny. Maybe there's a difference here between terminology in terms of what we mean by racism. In other words, a difference between racial bias, racism, language codes. What is racism to you?
Racism to me is racial hatred. And I learned this from my mother. My mother, when we were young, I was like 7, and we had lived in some military bases, and then we moved near my mother's family in the Midwest. And we, at first, for about a year, lived in an all-Black area, and then we lived we integrated an all-white area. And our mother taught us there's a difference between ignorance and hatred. So she said, pay attention when someone says something that you find offensive, because it may be just that they don't know any better. And that person who says that, if it's out of ignorance, if you handle it well, they could turn out to be your new best friend. Hatred comes out differently. And when you correct them and say that really hurts my feelings when you say that, and here's why, they keep doing it. So unless it's directed hatred, I try not to take offense. You know, if I live in an area, I live in Victoria and out in the suburbs, there are no Black Americans out here but me. So if somebody said something that was offensive according to the latest Black Lives Matter protesters, and I got offended, all that would do is make them uncomfortable with me. It would not inform them in any way. And if they didn't mean it to be offensive, why should I get offended? I guess I've been in Australia too long. I don't know.
You've been in Australia way too long, you don't sound like Americans sound. I mean, not to generalize, but I just saw a poll from the States of Hispanic Americans, and 4% of Hispanic Americans preferred the term Latinx to Latina or Latino. 4%. And yet Latinx is now the term for Latino and Latina Americans at national public radio, in the official government documents, in the Biden campaign. This has been taken on. This is just as an example. It's supposed to be a gender neutral, more politically correct term for Latino people. But this is something that has become entrenched as a result of largely white university educated elites insisting on the use of a term that the people who they're talking about themselves, 96% of them, don't even want to be called.
Well, look how they treat Black Americans who don't buy into the I'm the victim mindset. We get called white supremacists. And please understand, I am not part of that group that says that there is no racism. I am, above everything, a social psychologist. So I'm looking at patterns of behavior, nonverbal cues, eye contact, smiles, conversation, tone of voice. I've been trained to see how the differences in how people interact with each other. So I can tell the difference. I know there is still some racism. I'm not going to pretend, but I also know getting rid of it by having violent protests and looting and making white people so self-conscious around you, they're afraid to say anything, that is going to set up such an extreme backlash. It's going to take us back to like the 1890s. And notice again, they did not ask the Latinos what they wanted to be called. They decided for them. I found that scratch a lefty, find a racist. They are so elitists. They are so white man's burden with regard to ethnic minorities. They don't want us to make up our own minds. Nothing offends them more than a Black person saying, I'm not a victim.